Well, hey folks, and welcome to this lesson on social entrepreneurship. My name is Josh Shookman, and I'm the Chief Inspiration Officer at Social Change Nation. We are an online hub for people who are all about getting started and launching businesses in this new and exciting space. So, in today's presentation, I want to talk to you about what social entrepreneurship is, and why you're now a social entrepreneur as part of Fire Ed. And then lastly, we'll talk about some strategies you can use to grow your mission and impact as a social entrepreneur. So the first thing that I want to share with you is the definition of social entrepreneurship. So social entrepreneurship is a business where the social and business missions run in tandem. And what that means is, for a social entrepreneur, you really wouldn't have your business were it not for some kind of social good or social change that you want to create. So they're symbiotic. If you were to take one away, the entire business would collapse. Now, let's go ahead and talk about Fire Ed Interactive itself and how it fits the bill as a social entrepreneur's business. This is not just a business, but it's a movement of change agents like yourself who are devoted to changing the way that fire and life safety happens. So the more people who are taught, the more people we reach, the more we grow, and the larger impact we have. That's the movement that you're now a part of. Now, remember how I said that for social entrepreneurs, you can't have one without the other. The social and the business missions are symbiotic. So the way that's lived out here at Fire Ed is you're going to see our mission in everything that we do. Our founder, Tracy Last, she's been changing lives in this space for about 3 decades now. And also our instructors and many of the teachers and facilitators, they're firefighters or fire and life safety educators themselves. I mean, they have been out there in the field doing this because of the tragedy they've seen. In other words, they have some kind of a defining moment or defining moments in their lives that drive what they do and why they do it. And that's true for everyone who's part of Fire Ed Interactive. And it's important that we get to the bottom of that story for you as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but I just want you to understand right now that your story and your heart in this is a huge part of what we're about. Now, the thing is, as I mentioned before, you're going to see this, for us, you'll see this in our marketing, in our branding, and in the way that we measure success. So everything on our website, every story that we tell is the story of a life changed, an accident prevented, a life saved. And that's really how we measure success at Fire Ed, is how many people have we reached, how many children have we saved, how many programs do we have in schools, how many people are not victims of fire as a result of what we do. And that's really a big piece of it. Another piece of this that you'll see in our marketing and our branding and the way that we measure success is that we really are a movement. And we're a movement that's about changing the way that fire education is done. And so we measure success in terms of the impact and the transformation we see in terms of community programming. And that's what you're part of now. Okay, so let's talk about the building blocks of your social venture at Fire Ed Interactive. Because as part of this, you're now really in charge of your own mini social venture. So I want to talk to you about how to construct that. And basically, it's going to have 3 ingredients. It's going to have your why. It's going to have the branding that we help you with on Fire Ed. And then you're going to have a web presence, because on the Fire Ed portal, you'll actually be able to create your own page. So the first thing I want to talk about is your why. This, really simply put, is why do you do what you do? Make it deeply personal. Tell your story. Tell it at every touch point. Tell people about it with every interaction you have related to Fire Ed. And in terms of branding, that's why we're focused on allowing you to have a bio, talk on forums, that kind of thing on Fire Ed, because we want you to share that story. And lastly, you're going to have a web presence with that. You're going to have a place where you can direct people as you're out in the community facilitating programming, that they can go and learn more about you. Now, when you have that story, once you have that online presence, there are lots of ways that you can share it. And around that, you're going to want a marketing and funding plan. So let's talk about that now. So first of all, you will have your online presence on the FireEd site. And the ways you want to think about sharing that story are a couple examples here. Social media, we'll unpack that more here in a moment. You can also then share your story on our site. We have forums, we have chats, we have groups, that kind of thing. And people want to know your story. They want to know why you're here and what drives you into FireEd and what drives you to build this business that has a social impact as a crucial part of it. The other thing, as far as your marketing plan, the good news is a lot of this will be built in with FireEd. A lot of the materials that you get will talk to you about how to reach out to local fire departments and schools and how to empower people to teach others and then to grow the program. Your funding plan we'll speak a little bit more about. For now, just think about this, that most of the funding that you'll be working with will come either in the form of grants or program funding that fire departments and schools have. Okay, let's talk a little bit more in depth about social media for social entrepreneurs. Now, I find that when a lot of people get into social media, they get pretty overwhelmed by it pretty fast. And the main reason that this happens is because they try to get on every social media platform that's out there. You don't need to do that. When you're trying to share the story about what you're doing, and when you're trying to connect with people who you want to lead programming with or you want to network with for one reason or another, I really think you should just focus on 1 to 2 platforms and just nail the fire out of it. Now, I want to show you an example of this here. Now, the specific platforms will be different for everybody, but this is my company, Social Change Nation. And something that we have made a really specific point to do is to focus just on 2 social media platforms. And it's worked really well for us because you see, when we started, we were like, I find a lot of people are, when they're starting out, wanting to be on every single platform that everyone was telling us we needed to be on. Well, what happened was we didn't really grow anywhere. We were just kind of present everywhere. But we really wanted to grow and have engagement in a lot of social media platforms. So we took a step back and we said, okay, what are the 2 social media platforms that we can just focus on right now that we could really see some major growth in? In other words, what are the 2 social media platforms that are really doing the most good for us? Well, we pretty quickly realized that was Instagram and LinkedIn. And so let me just run to our Instagram page here real fast. So this is our page. You'll see our number of followers there and the activity. And what I want to highlight here is the activity, the number of comments, the number of likes, the number of shares, that kind of thing. Given our number of followers, this is actually quite high in terms of the number of likes and messages, compared to what's out there. Because simply put, people are busy and they're doing a lot on social media. And so they're not always going to have time to comment on the things that you're putting out there. It doesn't mean they're not seeing it. That's just kind of the way of it. And so a good way to measure it is, through these likes and comments. And usually when you're getting even a small percentage of your following to come and like and comment on what you're doing, that means you have pretty good engagement on that site. And so that was something that we figured out with Instagram. We really put a lot of effort into these pictures. A lot of these pictures come from people in our community. And that's just become a really big focal point for us. But the more important thing is that it's also driven people because they can click our link here. So someone, for example, could click your bio here and bring you back to the FireEd site, bring them back to your profile on the FireEd site. This has been huge for us because a lot of people click this and then run to our site. And so that's important. And I'm not showing you this to brag about my number of followers. I'm just showing you this to show you what can happen when you put focused intensity on that 1 or 2 social media platforms. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about LinkedIn here in a moment, but I just want to highlight for now that for most of us in FireEd, LinkedIn is going to be a really, really powerful tool. So it's one that I think for almost all of us is one of the 2 that you'll want to focus on, largely because you can join groups in your interest area and link up with other people who are doing very similar things to you. They're professionals and they're really focused a lot of times in these groups. So that's a really valuable thing to do. You'll see here I have memberships in lots of different groups that relate to social entrepreneurship, which is my core issue area. And so that's something that I think is really, really important to do. In order to do that, it's pretty simple. You would just go here and click groups, and the search bar is all I'm in, and then bam, you could search for any particular type of group that you wanted to be involved with. So again, the 1 to 2 social media platforms, that is going to vary to some extent depending on who you are and what you're up to. But I do find that overall for us in Fire Ed, LinkedIn is at least one of the two. And so I'd strongly recommend you check that one out. Okay, so that was a little primer on social media for social entrepreneurs. Just remember to keep it simple. Focus on those 1 to 2 platforms and nail the fire out of them. And don't listen to the people that tell you you need to be on, all 10 or 15 social media platforms out there. You just don't, you'll get overwhelmed pretty fast. Okay, so another thing we need to talk about that's really important for those of us at Fire Ed. Now, you'll have lots of resources on this as part of the portal, but I do want to just make sure and at least touch on this. So as facilitators out there, as people working with Fire Ed out there in the community, we're going to need to find ways to fund programming. And so I find for a lot of people that can be fairly daunting, but I also find that some of this can be cleared up by just kind of thinking through a few quick questions. The first thing that I find is that most people think they need more funding than they actually do. So I would really encourage you to take a few steps back and seriously consider the amount of funding that you think it's going to take to get these programs going. The reason I say that is because there are lots of creative ways to get programs rolling in communities. Think in terms of guerrilla marketing. In other words, where are the places that you can find that free exposure, that word of mouth, people to represent you. And I'm going to go ahead and escape this for 1 second because I do want to spend just a little bit more time on this. So where are those places where you will have leaders that will get behind your mission, who will really go to bat for you and lead the way in terms of spreading the word about the programs you're leading? Also, another trap that I find people get into is they spend too much on tech. So most of us I think will be okay here, but for example, this is when someone spends too much building out a website or building out a web presence or a social media presence or that kind of thing. You really don't need to do that. There are lots of free resources out there to get a great presence for yourself. The good news is we've given you a lot of tools at Fire Ed, like I'd mentioned earlier, to build your web presence and to link that up. And the other piece, though, of course, inevitably, running programming does demand funding. So just a few things you want to think about. This is how our programs are typically funded. They are either funded through grants. There is a lot of grant funding around fire prevention education. They are funded by bootstrapping as well, which basically means, you get a passionate group of people together in your community that want to see this happen. They throw in a few bucks to make the first round go, and then the students from the first round allow them to fund the second round and the third round and fourth round and so on. And so that's another way to think about it. If you can find a small group of people who are really committed to this idea and willing to help fund it, that's a really powerful way that we've seen these curriculums come up in a lot of places. The other piece is, of course, program funding. So a lot of our programs are launched just by fire departments and schools and other community organizations that want to see this happen. So for you wanting to see this happen in your community, that is definitely one of the core places that I would look is, what are the fire department schools in my area that might be open to funding this kind of program or have funds already to fund fire prevention education, because a lot of them do. And so those are the questions you'd want to ask yourself around funding. Okay, let's go ahead and keep rolling here. Okay, the other thing I want you to think about in terms of funding and just launching this venture and being a facilitator and being involved with the fire ed movement in general is the idea of lean principles in social entrepreneurship. So the first term I want you to be aware of is called MVP. Now this stands for your minimally viable product. And basically what that means is that, like I had mentioned before, I see a lot of people when they get into this, they really think they need to build out all these things, get business cards, make all these connections, and basically spend 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 months, even sometimes, preparing before they actually launch. You really don't need to do that. What you need is a group of people who have a problem you want to help solve and a solution to it. And the thing is, you have that already. You see, we know that fire prevention education is not being taught effectively in a lot of cases. We know that you now have the tool that will really help transform that. And I'm going to escape out of this again. This is advancing just a little too fast for me. So that's what you want to think about, is keeping it simple from that standpoint. The other way that you can think about this, and we talked about this a little bit before, are landing pages. And this is just as simple as you have your online presence already with fire ed. You have a page that you can direct people to learn more about what you're doing, because that's just the reality of our world nowadays. As you go out and link up with people and talk about running this program, they're going to want to go online and learn more about it and the good news is we have all that for you, so you don't really need to build that out. So that is an example of a lean principle right there, using the resources that you already have at your fingertips to tell people more about what you do. And the last thing that I want you to think about in terms of lean principles is the idea of customer interviews. In other words, a lot of times we think that we have a really good idea of how people are experiencing the problem, but we oftentimes learn a lot more when we go and talk to them and when we have a problem-centered focus. So let me give you an example of that. If you were looking at getting a fire ed program run in a school, I would do something like go to the principal or go to some of the teachers and ask them what they feel is not working with fire prevention education or the fire prevention that they've tried. Ask them what challenges they see their community facing around this issue. And then just listen. Listen a lot more than you speak. Just ask one or two very open-ended questions around what they experience with fire prevention education. And you'll get a wealth of knowledge from that. Of course, you're wanting to make sure you're talking to the right people that have been kind of plugged into this issue at some level, but talk to them and get an understanding of how they experience this problem, and that will help you know how to communicate with them about your solution. So those are the things that I want you to think about when it comes to lean principles for getting yourself started. Okay. I talked a little bit about this already, but the idea of using raw goods. So what I mean by that is you have the fire ed portal at your disposal. So that's a raw good that you have. What other connections do you have in your community already that could help you grow this movement? Friends, family who you believe would be very committed to this. Other firefighters you might have interacted with or engaged with who could become ambassadors with you. Those kinds of things. Take an inventory of the things you have at your fingertips and think about how you can use them as you work to grow your impact. Now, I want to show you one example of this. We had already looked at my company, Social Change Nation, but let's go ahead and look at a company that my wife and I run as well. We run a small hostel, and if you've not heard that before, it's like a small hotel in our hometown. Now, this is our landing page. And this is an example of a lot of things that I've talked with you about already, because this is a very simple from the standpoint of we didn't spend a ton of time or money creating it, but it actually looks really great. But it's a pretty straightforward landing page that allows people to do, at least at the top, just one thing: reserve your bed in the hostel. So we keep it pretty simple and pretty straightforward. But the biggest thing that I want to highlight is that when we launched this, you think about it, launching a hotel, that requires a lot of things like a building and furniture and all kinds of infrastructure, really, to actually have the stuff behind this button that people click, right? So that can seem pretty daunting. But the good news here is, at least in our case, we had happened to have a space that we had access to that was a loft space that we could pretty quickly, you can see some pictures of it here, pretty quickly transform into a hostel type environment. That sounded a little, so hostel or hotel type environment. So that's an example of a raw good that we happen to have at our fingertips, but we didn't necessarily think about that initially. I mean, when we wanted to start a hotel, we kind of thought, like everyone else did, that we would need to get a building and a loan and investors and all this crazy kind of scary stuff to get that thing going. But because we took some steps back and took inventory of the raw goods we had, we got this whole page and movement launched much more quickly than we would have otherwise. And you can see here, and this actually, we've had quite a few more nights, the 475 listed here. We've had upwards of 600 nights listed, and then one home built as well, and we're ready to build our second in Jamaica, because there is a social mission behind what we do. So that's the result. But we were able to start much more quickly. I don't even know if we would be fully launched today had we not taken inventory of the raw goods that we had at our disposal. And so those are the ways that I want you to be sure and think about as you come on as part of Fire Ed. Okay, see where that takes us. Okay, the last thing that I want to leave you with is this idea of growth hacking. So in other words, how do you, it's one thing to make your first round of connections with the first group and get your first program off the ground, but if you don't continue to fuel that, you'll have some challenges along the way. So I want to talk to you about having that growth mentality at all times. So there are a few things that you can definitely do, and we've talked about a lot of them. I'll just go ahead and highlight them here in terms of keeping your customer base growing. So the biggest one, like I mentioned before, is LinkedIn. I would really recommend you're involved and active in several groups on there and again though, keep it focused. These need to be groups that are really, really tightly aligned with what you believe and what your core issue areas are. Instagram can be a great way. It's a very interactive community. Continue building that, continue growing that, continue commenting on pictures. Facebook groups as well can be a great way of doing it. Can be a great way of connecting with new people around different issue areas. And so that's a really important thing, or certain Facebook pages, you can follow up with information on that. You can make connections, you can communicate directly with people on there. But having said that, this is case by case too. Because I've talked a lot about social media here, but certainly there are ways in your community that you can continue to engage in growth hacking, right? So if you've led one class, and then at the end of every class you give people some kind of a reward for referring you to someone that they know who might also want programming in their community, or someone that they know who is a decision maker at another school or another fire department, that kind of thing. That's the kind of growth hacking mentality I want you to have. In other words, growth hacking is always about having at the top of your mind what that next program looks like. How are you going, always thinking about how are you going to reach that next person? And how are you going to empower the people you're currently working with to help you do that? Right, so that's where I'm talking about, at the end of every program you do, ask everyone, who else do they know, who they could connect you with? Those are the types of things you can do to keep your movement growing. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close things out here now by talking about the future of social entrepreneurship. So again, you are now a social entrepreneur as part of the Fire Ed movement. This is a social entrepreneurs movement. And what that means is you're on the ground floor of a movement that is transforming the way business is done. And it's not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. This isn't just some passing fad. Stats actually back this up, that millennials especially want to do business with social good companies. They're willing to pay more for it. They want to be employed by these companies. Basically, what this means is that the world is demanding businesses that do well by the world. And as part of Fire Ed, that your heart is in this movement that's about helping people not become victims of fire, and it's about transforming the way that fire and life safety education is taught. And so what I'm here to tell you today is that you are on very, very solid ground, and you're on the ground floor, really, of a generational shift in the way that business is done. So I hope that excites you as much as it does me, and I hope that I've helped give you just a basic overview of how to present yourself as a social entrepreneur, because it's absolutely vital in today's business climate. It's absolutely vital in today's nonprofit climate, and it's absolutely vital in our communities that you present yourself, and present yourself proudly, as a social entrepreneur.